Uh, Thank you for joining us. As Wendy mentioned, my name's David Johnston. I'm a lawyer and CEO of a advisory company based in Charleston that focuses on resilience, finance, mitigation, and risk. And it's a pleasure to be with you. Some special thanks, Lindy. Again, without you, we could not have done this, and Meredith, of course. And also thanks to our sponsors and our panelists. And I'd like to give a special shout out to my friend who many of you know, Pam Williams. Pam has been very helpful to all of us, but especially me, in putting the panel together and securing the sponsorship of IEM. And as many of you know, Pam recently was sworn in at Fema as the new assistant administrator for grant programs. So thanks, Pam, and congratulations. Housekeeping, much of the same that you've already heard. This session will be recorded. Slides will be available. The program will be available for viewing on YouTube after we're finished. The format for us is each of our panelists will speak for 10 minutes. And then we're going to have a Q&A session for 35 minutes, where we will exchange ideas and respond to questions that I know I have, the other panelists have of one another, and hopefully we will get from the audience. Encourage the audience to put your questions in the questions box, and we will do our best to answer them during our 35-minute session. If by chance we do not get to them all, we will be sure to follow up after the session. There will be plenty of time. One thing, just to let the folks know, that this panel has had so much fun sort of working together and sharing ideas that we found we had many things in common and many to share, that we are going to continue to work together after this panel and after this program. So there will be opportunity for more engagement among us and with you in the audience. So the band is going to stay together. Let me set the table a little bit for the topic and why we think it's important and why we chose it. I think all of us have seen the challenges that all sorts of organizations, communities, sectors have in financing resilience and sort of overcoming the issues that are created by everybody doing their own thing. What we have seen, what the panelists have seen, and I have certainly seen a good bit of, is smaller, unrepresented, often rural communities have similar challenges but unique ones. And what we wanted to do with this panel is to zero in on the unique challenges that are faced by smaller, underserved communities, and the kinds of things that can be done to assist in addressing their issues. There is some overlap with sort of the challenges of larger communities, but we really wanted to drill down on the smaller communities' challenges. In putting our panel together, we we were very purposeful in bringing together folks from multiple sectors. So as you will have seen, if you look at the meeting materials and the bios, all of which are very impressive, so I'd encourage you to look at them. We have representation from the federal government. We have representation from the philanthropic sector, the nonprofit sector, and the banking sector. And we think that collectively, the points of view of these different sectors will result in good information sharing and a very robust conversation. With that, I would like to introduce our first panelist. And her name is Summer Montefino. Summer is a friend and a colleague who I have worked with on a number of projects, including one in Charleston. Summer currently serves as strategic director for the American Flood Coalition. The Flood Coalition is doing marvelous work and has been for a number of years, providing tools and collaborative opportunities for various organizations, primarily in the flood and water-related issues, but with lots of applications to other resiliency challenges. So look forward to hearing from Summer and her experiences and the work of the Flood Coalition. Summer, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, David, and for really setting the table for the entire session today. We can advance to the next slide, please. Thanks. So I'll start out by just giving a bit of an overview on the American Flood Coalition for those who may not be familiar with us. Like David was saying, we're a nonpartisan coalition of leaders from flood-affected communities around the country, all of whom have come together in a common platform to advance solutions and advocate for resources to address flooding and sea level rise in their communities. So we have over 280 members across 21 states, and those members cover all of the different categories that you see on this slide. So that's elected officials at all levels, cities, towns, and counties, businesses and business associations, military groups, and civic and academic groups. And we can advance to the next slide. Thank you. I wanted to highlight in particular, given the theme of today's session with a focus on smaller and underrepresented communities, how those communities are a crucial part of the American Flood Coalition. So what you see on this slide is that 70% of AFC's municipal members, which refers to those cities, towns, and counties, have a population less than 50,000. And when you break it down even further than that, 1/3 of our municipal members actually have a population under 10,000. So we're hearing about these types of challenges really frequently, and I wanted to share that just as a way of setting up that those are the perspectives I'll be bringing to bear when I'm speaking about the different challenges and opportunities that we see in funding resilience for small and underrepresented communities. We can move to the next slide. Thank you. So that first challenge that I want to highlight is a really fundamental one, which is actually identifying innovative projects. There's a big difference between knowing that your community has a problem and having a fundable project idea in hand that you can use to start going after different sources of funding and financing. So a lot of the questions we hear in this vein are along the lines of, where should we start? How are similar communities approaching this issue? And that can mean similar in terms of size or resources available, which are obviously related, or similar in terms of type of flooding that's being experienced. And additionally, and I wanted to highlight this question because I think it's so important for today's topic, there's also this critical question around how can flood resilience projects promote equity and support underrepresented communities. And to dig in a little further there, on the right-hand side, I've included a statistic which comes from a series of roundtables that AFC held with community-based organizations that work with frontline communities in flood-affected areas. And when we polled them, 83% said that they disagreed or strongly disagreed that their community's input was valued and taken into consideration for decision making. And so that's obviously really staggering to see that there's a huge disconnect between what frontline communities have to say and how decision-making processes are unfolding. We can move to the next slide. So what's the opportunity here? How can we help communities to identify innovative projects and have a starting point from which they can really work toward funding? So one way that AFC is approaching this is through our Adaptation for All guide, which provides a series of case studies, mostly from the US, but also a few from the Netherlands, that are very much geared towards small communities. So it was important to us that most of these case studies were taken from communities with populations less than 50,000, and that this guide digs in and shares some of the pieces of information that are most important for communities when they're trying to assess whether this type of project could fit into their strategy. So that's things like, what's the average cost? What do the benefits generally look like? Are there other implementation considerations like, maintenance costs over the lifetime of the project? What sources of funding could we use to actually get this project off the ground? I'll note as well that there's a through line in this guide of the importance of equity in serving vulnerable communities, whether that's low-income communities, communities of color, seniors, and so on, and the importance of those perspectives being central to identifying projects. The intent here is really to make it easier for communities of all size to start identifying projects and get started. And with that, I'll move to the second challenge, which is understanding what funding is available, which I'm sure is a topic that many of us on this panel and on this call get asked about maybe most frequently of anything. If this slide looks complicated, it's for a reason, which is that especially for federal flood resilience funding, funding is really disaggregated across dozens of federal agencies, even greater number of programs, and it can quickly become a full-time job to understand just one program in one agency, let alone try and untangle the web of federal funding that's out there and piece it back together into a coherent strategy. And when you think about the resources and capacity that smaller and under-resourced communities have to bear, it becomes even more challenging to really start to parse through this and come up with a plan. I'll also note, because I'm sure this is on the minds of many of the panelists and folks listening in today, with the recent influx of federal infrastructure dollars that we're expecting from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is a great step forward. There's going to be a greater amount of resources, a greater number of programs that could be used for flood resilience. And while that's a great thing, I think it's worth noting that it will lead to also greater levels of confusion and complexity, and a need to really work more closely with locals to ensure that those dollars are making it down to folks that need it the most. And with that, we can go to the next slide. So one way that AFC is approaching this challenge of helping communities to understand what funding is available is through a tool that we've created called the Flood Funding Finder. And this tool, I'll note, is available publicly on our website, which is floodcoalition.org. You can also find the Adaptation for All guide there. The idea of this tool is that it's interactive and it brings together a series of federal funding programs that can be used for flood resilience and makes them filterable with kind of an eye to the questions that small communities would have, such as, does this program give consideration to small communities? Does it require a cost share or matching funds? Can we use in-kind services to contribute to that cost share? Does it require a presidential disaster declaration? Those types of questions, which can be so important and help communities figure out what makes the most sense as they're putting together the pieces. Also, can it be used for planning and design? So that's one way that we try to put out information that's accessible and usable as that first step to understand the landscape of what's out there. Again, I'll mention the infrastructure package, and that's a place of focus and obvious importance and priority to our members. So you'll definitely see more information coming out from us about what communities should know about new programs or existing program processes over the coming year. And with that, we can move to the last challenge that I'll be speaking about, which is a really fundamental one that in some ways underpins the previous two I was talking about. And that challenge is that small and underrepresented communities often really lack the capacity to scope out projects to the level of detail that's required to apply for funding and then apply for funds. As I'm sure most of us on this call are aware of, larger cities will of course have a greater amount of resources, greater staff, and I wanted to give a couple of examples to sort of paint that picture a bit more fully. So the first example is from Florida, which is that municipalities under 5,000 people have an average of 19 municipal full-time staff members. And then you compare that to cities with a population of over 60,000, which have over 1,000 full-time staff members. That's an order of magnitude difference. It's also worth noting that for larger cities, there may be really specialized staff. There may be a city engineer or grant writers or a resilience department, and that's really a far cry from the types of capacity and expertise that are available within smaller municipalities. And then also to really, going back to the previous slide for one more moment, to highlight the fact that it's not uncommon for rural counties to share a contract county manager across multiple counties. And why does this matter? What does it lead to? When you think about the fact that communities may have to fill out hundreds of pages for an application or undergo expensive engineering assessments just to clear that first hurdle of applying, it really kind of explains how this can end up, really deterring communities from applying or can set them up for failure. So now we can move to the next slide. Thank you. What are the opportunities? How can we build capacity and really fill that pre-development and scoping gap that we're seeing? There are two kind of exciting trends that we're seeing at the regional and state level that I wanted to highlight. So the first is through regional collaboratives, which I know is a topic near and dear to David's heart. Regional collaboratives can help small communities to pool resources and work together and achieve scale. So that can be through watershed vulnerability assessments and planning, that can be through regional applications for funding, and so on. And then at the state level, as we all know, the state is that crucial conduit between local and federal government and can serve as an important layer for technical assistance to help communities access funding. I'll note briefly that the American Flood Coalition has convened the State Resilience Partnership along with the Pew Charitable Trusts to monitor and provide information and support best practices in state-level flood resilience. So if you're interested in learning more there, I would recommend checking out stateresilience.org. And with all of that, this is a huge challenge that we're talking about today. I'm so excited to hear the perspectives of the other panelists here. But I did want to end on that bright note that we're seeing a lot of opportunities to give communities the tools that they need and to help them build capacity to get started and access funding. So thank you so much. Looking forward to hearing the rest of the panelists and taking some of your questions.
Summer, thank you. Tremendous presentation, and commend the Flood Coalition on the work that it and being led by you is doing to create collaborative relationships among various groups, creating the tools to help all of us figure out what can be done, how to do it, to connect the dots. And the chart that you showed of all the potential funding sources, each of which is difficult to sort through by itself, and how they all fit together and how to connect the dots among all of them, I think is a challenge for all of us, as the other panelists will address as well. So thank you for your splendid work on that. Our next panelist is Regine Webster. Regine is Vice President of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Regine, welcome. Regine and I have had a chance to chat a bit about the importance of philanthropy in the overall scheme of addressing needs and finding collaborative solutions. And in many of these programs that I've been involved with, the philanthropic sector sometimes doesn't get heard from. And as we know, the philanthropic sector is a major factor in addressing problems, raising funding, and creating collaboration. Often we hear about philanthropy, but don't understand how it works, what it needs, and what its objectives are. So Regine is going to tell us about all that.
Absolutely. And you can go to the next slide, please. So the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, I don't know if it's an entity that's known to all of you. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of our, 101. Essentially, the center was founded to be a resource for private philanthropy, so that corporate foundations, institutional foundations, family foundations, high net worth individuals, you name it, would have a resource to go to understand the landscape both of disasters, as well as how to channel their financial resources in the most effective manner. So I love how Summer ended talking about funding, and I'm going to pick up that thread and talk about funding here as well. So we do our work through 3 channels. The first is what we do to educate the private philanthropic community, right? Educating funders. We do it through our webinars, through a blog that I might write. We also do a fair amount of research with Candid, where we track, monitor, and analyze about 13 to 14 different data sources to understand the kind of the panoply of funding that goes into particular disaster events. We also manage funds. So right now we have a COVID-19 response fund, we have a global disaster recovery fund, a domestic disaster recovery fund, and several other funds. And we do that for a few reasons. One, we believe that pooling funds is a really smart way for philanthropy to be most effective in their work. And we also do it to serve as a model of what effective disaster recovery looks like. Our emphasis is entirely on recovery. We rarely do relief funding. We know that 80% of all disaster dollars that go in to a particular event come within the first 2 months. And I know that this is not a strange new idea to you all, but 80% of the work happens far beyond those post those 2 months. And then lastly, we do consulting work. So just like any other philanthropic consulting firm, we do strategic planning, we do research, we do presentations, convenings, you name it. As long as the word disaster or humanitarian crisis is in the title, we are all in. The only leg up that we've had on any other organization as it relates to the pandemic is that we were virtual from inception. So we knew how to use Zoom before Zoom was cool. I don't know that Zoom is cool anymore, but we're still using it. And I am located just up the road from you all in Nashville, Tennessee. So it's nice to be with an audience that cares deeply about the Southeast and Caribbean. Next slide, please. When we think about what a disaster is, fundamentally our kind of orientation point is that a disaster occurs when hazard meets vulnerability. And while we are not scientists, we very closely attend to underserved communities and historically marginalized communities, because those 2 communities are the ones that are going to have the largest, the greatest number of root causes, the greatest dynamic pressure, and the most unsafe conditions. And then when you couple that with a hazard, in particular flood events, earthquake events, tornadic events, that's where you get a disaster. Slide, please. So the root causes, we know that disasters fundamentally exacerbate systemic inequities that already exist. I'm sure, and I know we're going to hear from Fema in a minute, but I'm sure you all know that that we're learning every day more that low-income communities of color are disproportionately worsened and disproportionately, how would I say this? Sorry, have a disproportionately more difficult time to recover following a disaster event compared with their middle-income white counterparts. So we also know, right, that a disaster affects housing, education, healthcare, social services, and so much more. So in my organization, when we're speaking with our philanthropic counterparts, we're saying, okay, let's look across the entire arc of a disaster. Let's look all the way through to the end of recovery. And let's also look at that with the lens of racial and intersectional equity. So let's go ahead and next slide, please. So what does that mean for us? Like, we want transformative change, and We do that in light of an event that has disrupted communities, shook them at their very foundations. I don't know if this came out earlier in any earlier conversations, but you know, even just today, 3 hours ago in Tonga, there was a 6.2 magnitude earthquake. So we know that you're talking about event on top of event, further destabilizing communities. So everything that we do at CDP is done with a social and racial justice lens. We look every day through our grant making to serve communities of color, marginalized communities of color. We every day look at ways to lend our voice to upending systemic racism and what we can do through our philanthropic power. Next slide. I don't know about you guys, but I have read more than my fair share of IRS tax form 990s than maybe I care to admit. Like a lot of 990s. And it's so interesting to me because I've had so many conversations with, say, corporate foundations, for example, and they'll say like, oh, well, we don't do disaster funding. And I'm like, wait, yes, you do. You do, because you funded for Ida, or you funded a home repair exercise in Houston, or you funded vulnerable populations, right? Communities of color, seniors, low income. All of those are disaster in nature, right? They all are preparedness efforts. They are all prevention efforts. They're all mitigation efforts. Next slide. So when we think about, again, this is us speaking to philanthropy here. We work every day to ask philanthropy to take that long view, but beyond that mass care need, we ask them to be as unfettered and flexible in their funding as they can possibly be. We work through our brown bags, through our webinars, through the convenings that we do to encourage the sharing of best practices. There's so much to be learned from our colleagues over in California who are looking at wildfire mitigation, and all of that interesting work can be translated over to, to our Gulf Coast. So we work to do that. We actively connect other donors and other funders, and we, again, through our research and our writing, we look to our past disasters to think forward. I want to spend a minute talking to you about a program that we run in the Midwest. I know it's a different geography than this particular geography, but it has resonance. It's called our Midwest Early Recovery Fund. And it's a fund that is dedicated to the 10-state area that flank the Mississippi and Missouri River watershed. So lots of those rural communities that Summer was just talking about, under 5,000, lots of those communities that suffer repeat flooding events, and yet are not, that either the size or scope of the disaster is not large enough to bring forth a presidential declaration. So they are just underattended, low attention disasters, right? There's no media attention. There's no huge volunteer teams coming in from out of state, what have you. So our work there is really to build the capacity of organizations that are actively preparing for, actively responding to disasters. And hi, David. Okay, I'm getting the hook. No, I'm not getting the. I have a 1 minute till I get the hook, right? So anyway, I'd love to tell you more about the work that we do in the Midwest. Again, because there's so much hydrometeorological focus of what we do. Would love to change that. Before I sign off, I want to tell you about 2 resources that we have. The first, next slide, please. Thank you. The first is our Disaster Philanthropy Playbook. That's where it's a resource that's available for communities, community foundations, place-based funders. They can pick it up and understand how to go about funding for early childhood services, how to go about funding for mental health, how to go about funding with a racial and intersectional equity lens. And then secondly is our Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy. It's a report that gets published every November. That said, I have to be honest, I like the mapping platform that's on our website even better because that's updated on a monthly basis. But what you're going to see there is that private philanthropy and corporations notionally year over year allocate about $500 million to disasters. In contrast, you'll see the billions that are allocated both by FEMA, HUD, EDA, and then also other bilateral, for international purposes, other bi and multilateral organizations. So I will sign off there. And thanks so much, David, for having me.
Tremendous. Regine, it's so helpful to better understand, one, what your organization does, because it's doing great work. I'm hoping more people will understand what you're doing as a result of this. And two, having a better feel for how philanthropy works in resilience, and how philanthropy can work with the other sectors, so that together and on a collaborative basis, we can leverage resources together. So thank you for your tremendous work, and we'll talk some more on the Q&A. Thank you. Our next panelist is Dorothy Abreu. Hello, Dorothy. How are you?
Hello, David.
Dorothy is Senior Vice President of Public Finance at PNC Bank. Dorothy, thank you for PNC for being a sponsor. We appreciate it a great deal. PNC, I've been around banks for a long time. I'm an old bank lawyer, emphasis on the old. And have been involved with banks and their initiatives and how they work over a number of years. And I have to say that PNC is truly one of the leaders and innovators in finance and programs and community support involving resiliency. Dorothy and her team have been instrumental and will continue to be in this kind of work. I've had the pleasure of working with Dorothy and some of her colleagues on some of this work, and it's very important and taken a lot of leadership from PNC. So with that, Dorothy, tell us about the work that you do and what PNC is doing.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. Summer, Regina, great information. Thank you so much for sharing. So I'll continue to carry that thread along. And as you said, David, I'm honored to be here representing banking and specifically PNC in today's forum. You know, we know that it takes intentionality of thought and action to affect change. And we're clearly in good company here today. If we could yet go to the next slide. So throughout our history, PNC has actively supported vital community organizations and civic institutions. We've aggressively promoted economic growth and housing stabilization, partnered with municipalities to address critical issues ranging from gun violence to financial literacy, and have led initiatives to enhance the educational opportunities afforded to our community's youngest learners. This past year, PNC has continued our journey to intentionally transform how we approach community in the areas of lending, investment, partnerships, programming, and volunteerism. We believe that fostering economic empowerment, education, and entrepreneurism, particularly in traditionally underserved communities, just makes good business sense. And this intent has culminated in the announcement of our community benefits plan early last year. Beginning this month, PNC is committed to provide $88 billion in loans, investments, and other financial support to bolster economic opportunity for low and moderate income individuals and communities over the next 4 years. These funds, as you can see, include $47 billion in home lending, $26.5 billion in small business lending, and $14.5 billion in community development financing. As a Main Street banking institution, it is our explicit aim to offer products, services, and support for all communities and all income groups in our footprint, across our footprint. As PNC, we've historically achieved and were last rated outstanding on our CRA examination. And as many of you know, an institution in this group has an exemplary record of and is a leader in ascertaining and helping to meet the credit needs of its entire delineated community. which obviously includes low and moderate income neighborhoods in a manner that's consistent with our resources and our capabilities. On the housing front, we continue to actively support multiple workforce and affordable housing developments across the United States. We know that it requires collaboration to affect the change we wish to realize. And one way we believe we will achieve this is through intentional support of CDFIs, community development investment corporations. By extending large, low-cost loan capital to these strategic partners, we have an ability to create a ripple effect that's far greater than our individual efforts alone could achieve. A few recent examples that took place in my district, the Chicagoland market, include PNC joining the local mayor and a local commissioner in announcing an investment into a CDFI's $330 million affordable housing facility. We hold a $30 million investment in that facility, and as a result are one of the organization's largest investors. Another example is a partnership with instrumentality of a local housing authority. PNC has provided low-cost, long-term financing for more than 100 workforce housing units across our territory. And most recently, we've provided direct financing to a national affordable housing developer to build a housing complex for seniors, ensuring that some of our most vulnerable citizens have increased access to adequate housing, care, and support. And, relative to the overlap of small business and community development, we remain active in making investments and loans into the infrastructure and businesses located in historically disinvested, underserved communities, with billions, invested across our footprint again. A couple of examples include a public-private community development with the City of Chicago and a housing authority. The project expanded affordable health care options and facilitated the opening of 2 African-American owned restaurants in a historically disinvested area. Another example is a fresh foods development in the Englewood community, along with a local market development in our South Shore neighborhood. Both of these developments brought full service grocery stores to areas that have been identified as food deserts. But I think for me, most importantly, each of these projects required minority participation to meet metrics tied to the grant dollars needed to bridge the equity gap. Another example of creative collaboration occurred this past September when we provided a $1.5 million grant to support the launch of a microequity fund. This program created an accelerated access to capital for Black and other underserved diverse business owners and entrepreneurs on Chicago's South and West sides by providing equity to leverage debt, or just provided equity when debt was not a viable option. And while these are specific examples of minority inclusion, the principle applies to any small business or community lacking scale and needing support to grow their enterprise. Next slide, please. At PNC, we also recognize the unevenness of the economic landscape within our communities and the long-term impact historic racism and structural inequities have caused. So in addition to credit support, we are also investing resources to help end systemic racism, improve ways in which we impact our natural environment, and create meaningful products to make banking more accessible for all, and a continuation of support to our youngest learners through our Grow Up Great, PNC's signature philanthropic initiative. We launched it in 2004, and today Grow Up Great is a corporate-wide effort to promote and enhance early childhood education. Next slide, please. And while what we're doing collectively is great, we know that transformation begins with people, and it's having the right individuals in the right positions working together to do the right things for the right reasons. And PNC sparked the transformation of how we approach diverse talent in 2009 with the hiring of Marsha Jones to head a new initiative focused on diversity and inclusion through EBRG groups and D&I councils. More recently, in 2020, Richard Bynum was appointed as Executive Vice President and Chief Corporate Responsibility Officer, where today he currently leads the PNC Foundation, Community Affairs, Corporate Social Responsibility, Community Development, and Diversity Inclusion. An additional individual that joined PNC in the executive ranks alongside Richard is Carol Brown, and she heads our PNC's asset management group. Under her leadership, the bank formed a new board of directors committee exclusively focused on equity and inclusion. And, all three of these individuals are incredibly and exceptionally talented and hold key positions through which they support and advance impactful business decisions within our organization and across our footprint. And, we know meaningful change takes time, change takes collaboration, and change requires being willing to take chances on long-term strategies that may not necessarily be seen as needed, essential, or even fully understood. So I am extremely proud that our leadership team had the courage to affect the change that we benefit from today. And, I know each of us here today is because, we as a country and as a global community face significant changes to our environment, which is leaving many of our communities, especially our smaller and less affluent areas, particularly vulnerable. So I believe we have the right people here today. We've heard, we've heard from Regina, we've heard from Summer, Flood Coalition. We have individuals that are holding, just really key, important positions. And I know that we're all here because we want to work together in an impactful way. So, my challenge to all of us is let's find one another, let's collaborate, and let's intentionally continue to make a difference in our community. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, David.
Thank you, Dorothy. Great presentation. It's important to have, as we talk about resiliency, to have your banks and banking in general perspective and engagement in resiliency. How we pay for things is an important part of the process, and PNC has certainly found new and creative ways, as have others in the financial institutions world, to do it, because as you said, it's good for business, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. I think good business can translate into good community development and involvement, and that's good for all of us. The word you used, collaboration, as Summer did, as Regine did, and as our next panelist is going to do, is just critical to the success of effective resiliency, and particularly in smaller, underserved communities that may not have the capacity or the resources by themselves, but together and collaboratively can accomplish things. So thanks for what you're doing. Thanks for your leadership. And we'll talk on the Q&A. Thank you.
All right, thanks, David.
Our last, but certainly not least, panelist is Angie Gladwell from Fema. We're so lucky to have her. As all of you know, Fema is very, very busy with very many important things. And Angie, as you certainly saw from her bio, has been for many years and is now front and center with many of those important initiatives. So we're lucky to have her, and it's a really unique opportunity to hear from someone with her stature and her insight at such an important institution for resilience. I know a little bit about Fema and have worked with Fema over the years, but have found that it's big and it's massive and it's important, and it does many things, and it does many things that people don't know that it does. So we're lucky to have Angie's sort of insight. Her presentation will give us lots to think about and lots to talk about, and bring her experience and commitment to this group. So Angie, thank you, and then turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, David, for that introduction. And it's an honor and privilege to be here this morning among this my fellow panel members. And I want to share, I think it's very true what David says, that there's so much that Fema does that sometimes folks are not aware of. And with that, although I am here and I'm going to be talking about our mitigation-focused grant programs that are available really for resilience and mitigation, I want to pull another thread that was discussed and share briefly another hat that I wear at Fema, which is the deputy chair of a group called the Mitigation Leadership Group, which is an interagency body focused on mitigation policy. And we, a couple years ago, spent time developing a national mitigation investment strategy. And it was really, the vision of that strategy was very similar to a point that Regine made, that all funding is disaster funding. And our perspective with the National Mitigation Investment Strategy is that all funding is mitigation and resilience funding. And so an analogy one of my team members used that I want to share with you is that we've traditionally seen mitigation as the cherry on top of a sundae that you may or may not put on that sundae. And instead, what we want to be thinking about is how mitigation and resilience are part of the flavor of that ice cream, which is without which we would not have a sundae. And so I just want to put that out there for you, because again, as I share a few words about our programs and where we're headed, with the point that Summer made about this opportunity with the Infrastructure Jobs Act, the conversation we're having at the interagency level is how do we look at all of this opportunity and being able to use that to address the needs of our underrepresented and smaller communities. So with that, I'll go into the next slide. One of the things that's been very exciting for us at Fema over the past month is the release of our new Fema strategic plan. And within that plan, there have been 3 goals that I think feed very nicely into this conversation. Those goals in the plan are to instill equity as a foundation of emergency management, lead the whole of community and climate resilience, and promote and sustain a ready Fema and prepared nation. And so as we've looked at our suite of hazard mitigation assistance grant programs, we've really tried to build that overall vision into our work specifically. And to the point that Dorothy just made, we're starting that with our people, making sure that we're able to recruit and hire the top talent that's reflecting diversity, inclusion, and the best perspectives that we really need to inform our work, creating an environment of culture of collaboration and innovation. And then being able to provide some focused assistance to underserved communities, helping to really focus on how we can best equip our partners to manage the mitigation investments required to reduce their future risk, and how we can help in building the capacity needed so that those who need our assistance most can access it. So next slide, please. So we have a range of programs within our portfolio. All of them are designed to help communities become more resilient in the face of natural hazards. We know that mitigation investments that take future conditions or future changes into account will help them be more resilient in the long run. We have some programs that are available only on a disaster cycle. And then we have others that are available on an annual cycle. In fact, 2 of our programs, flood mitigation assistance and building resilient infrastructure in communities, have a deadline that's fast approaching tomorrow for the 21 cycle. So in some of our programs, like the BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, or our flood mitigation assistance, we can actually change some of the program criteria to drive outcomes like equity or helping to ensure their reach in disadvantaged communities. In some of our other programs, like the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program that's available post-disaster, we really need to work specifically with our partners, with our local, state, tribal, territorial partners, to be able to have a shared responsibility in terms of achieving those outcomes. And so, you know, again, one of the things that we see and know is that there is a lack of capability and capacity sometimes to be able to get the foot in the door for the programs that we offer. And that has become a primary focus for us as we move forward. Not only do we look at those that are currently applying for our programs and how we assist them, but who's not applying that should be? How do we start to really increase and focus that reach so that we can help them get their foot in the door? Next slide, please. So one of the things that's really exciting for us is that 2 of our programs, the BRIC program and flood mitigation assistance, have been identified as pilot communities for the administration's Justice 40 initiative. So the Justice 40 initiative sets the goal that 40% of the overall benefits of federal investments from covered programs flow to disadvantaged communities. And so this slide just gives you an idea of what how disadvantaged communities are characterized under the Justice 40 initiative. And we really think that this is a really great opportunity for us to be able to really articulate how our communities are reaching disadvantaged communities, to measure our progress, and make sure that the changes and the things that we're doing are helping us get to real change. Next slide, please. So before I talk a little bit about some of the things we're doing to improve equity in our programs, I also want to touch a bit on the barriers that we've identified that communities may face when pursuing federal funding. And so some examples of those are having the technical skills required to apply for federal funding. Again, we know that there are, you know, a lot of requirements. Sometimes they are the years in making to do the planning, the design, the benefit cost analysis, and other things required to apply for our funding. And so that can really be a barrier for folks. Also having the right partners that can be able to assist in the capability and capacity building. Again, we know there are a lot of entities and organizations that are very interested in helping communities develop the capability and capacity, bring cost share to the table for our programs, and we, but sometimes don't have those partnerships or relationships established. So that's sometimes a barrier. And specifically that cost effectiveness requirement is one that we often find to be a barrier, especially for the smaller and poorer communities. While this is not exhaustive, it certainly helped us as we are planning for our programs and some of the next steps. We've also been working with the RAND Corporation to be able to help us in moving towards this goal. And so here are some of the ways that they have started to identify some of the things that we can do to be able to continue to evolve our program towards equity. And certainly as we have been getting this new BRIC program off the ground, so we are in the second year of the program right now, we are starting to really evaluate that against equity and risk criteria, again, to see where those decisions are really focused on those most at risk and most in need, and then where we need to evolve from there. Next slide, please. So several times we've mentioned the new Infrastructure Act that was put into place. A couple things that I just want to emphasize that apply to us. Mostly that funding, which there's a total of $6.8 billion that was provided across Fema for our programs, including $5 billion over 5 years for our mitigation programs. Primarily, this pluses up existing programs. So there's $1 billion earmarked over 5 years for a BRIC program, $3.5 billion for over 5 years for our flood mitigation assistance program. We think this is an excellent opportunity for us to especially look at repetitive losses, people who are repeatedly flooding, and being able to address those needs. And then we have $500 million appropriated for a new program under the Storm Act, which is an exciting opportunity. It basically authorizes us to give capitalization grants to states to set up revolving loan program for mitigation activities. And so this is a really good opportunity for us to really look across our suite of programs and what gaps we have and how we can use this new program to fill those gaps. Next slide. So I want to just share an example of a specific project that we had as part of last year's BRIC program project selection. And this is the historic town of Princeville, North Carolina, which, if you're not familiar with Princeville, it's the oldest community chartered by African Americans in the United States. It was established by freed slaves after the Civil War and incorporated back in the late 1800s. And like many economically disadvantaged communities across the nation, it was built in a high-risk area. It's located in the floodplain of the Tar River. And as a result, the residents of Princeville have experienced major and repetitive flooding events for over 200 years. I've been with Fema for 23 years and know I have personally seen Princeville flood several times within that frame. This BRIC project will help mitigate repetitive loss of infrastructure by relocating critical lifeline utilities, emergency support services, and 54 units of affordable housing outside of the floodplain. In addition, it will create over 5 acres of green open space and incorporate nature-based solutions with detention basins planted with vegetation to hold stormwater. And so this is a good example of, while we can't go back and undo unfair practices of the past, we can change the future viability of communities like Princeville. And we're hoping that our programs can help in fostering innovation and sets of solutions that are really going to change the risk profile of these communities in the future. For the sake of time, I'm going to go forward 3 slides, if I could, to direct technical assistance. And just talk about one of the exciting things that we're doing as part of our BRIC program is providing non-financial direct technical assistance to state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. This allows applicants to be able, through a very simple 1-page letter, to say they need assistance and help so that they can apply for our programs. And so while we had 8 communities selected in the first year of the program, we're going to select up to 20 communities in this next phase of our program and try to bring collectively the resources together over a 1 to 3 year period that communities need to really build some of their capabilities. And then finally, as I close, I just wanted to focus on a moment on partnerships. This is a big focus for us. We are looking at the national level, the regional level, and how we support communities and developing the partnerships that are needed to not only build capacity and capability, but also really leverage the money that exists across all of the funding sources, so that the money we're providing through our grant programs is able to go that much further in order to support resilience. So with that, I look forward to the dialogue that follows. Thank you very much.
David, I believe you're on mute.
There we go. Now I'm back. Angie, thank you. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your leadership. Thanks for helping us understand some of the things that FEMA is doing. It's doing a lot, some of which are known, some are not, but we will try to learn more. Very important part of what's going on in this country. So thank you for your time and all your work. I think we are now, remarkably, we're pretty close to being on time. I think we've got 15 minutes for questions and comments, and then I'm going to do a brief wrap up. So if each of the panelists could turn their camera on, we will all talk together for a bit. Great, an impressive group, an impressive group. Angie, just picking up on something that you were just talking about, can you address how the private sector can engage with FEMA to support the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program? One thing I wanted to come to a couple of times during the Q&A is the engagement of the private sector in all of this. Everybody is important, but we need to get the private sector engaged. We need the private sector to understand how it can get engaged and then get it done. So can you address that specific one?
Absolutely, and I'm sure other panel members will have some thoughts on this as well, but I think the private sector is a critical partner in all of this. Again, our funding typically flows through the tribe or the state to the local communities, but most of our infrastructure in this country is run by private entities and organizations, and so I think, again, recognizing the role that they play in the built environment and helping us to structure financial incentives for resilience and just helping to provide some of the capital that's needed for these investments is just so important.
If the private sector wants to engage with FEMA or find out what FEMA needs, or find a way to collaborate or partner, what's the best way to do that? Angie, to you.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, I am certainly happy to provide an in for some of those conversations. One of the things that we're doing, again, right now at the national level is we have a partnership coordinator in our division, specifically looking at how we are trying to look at the landscape of partners and prioritize those nationally, both across all of the sectors, to be able to do that. And so we are very much in a learning mode as we're really starting to establish a framework for developing these partnerships. So we're very eager to learn and to think about what's possible there.
Thank you. Maybe that's one of those things that as the band stays together and continues to play after this program, we can talk about further, because we certainly have folks on this call who can help with that. Dorothy, let me ask you a question. PNC is doing great things. Can you talk about some of the innovative financing programs or ideas it is embarked on? One that I'm familiar with, which perhaps you can address is PNC's a bridge loan financing program that it
Sure.
is doing with Fema and USDA, I believe. Could you address that?
Okay. Sure. So David, as you know, like we make money by lending money, right? So we're always looking for opportunities to do so. And oftentimes, as Angela said, you know, there are FEMA dollars that are available, but the scope of the projects is so far greater than the funds that are available to meet the need. And so one of the ways that we have done this, not just with FEMA, so what you asked, you know, what mentioned specifically was a bridge loan that we provide, which means that if FEMA awards a project X dollar amount, generally the funds are dispersed as the project is completed. So there's this gap between getting the project done and the funds being available to cover the project costs. So we'll step into that gap, provide a facility that can be drawn down during the construction or renovation project, and then once the project is complete, then the funds from FEMA come in and the debt is eradicated. And it's the same methodology. What we'll do is, if there's a project that requires remediation, perhaps it's a shoreline that's disintegrating, but in addition to that, there's, as is, I think she mentioned, it was Princeville, right? So if there's a situation where there's housing that's being impacted and we want to do flood mitigation in addition to, you know, some affordable housing, well, that's a much larger project. And so how do we leverage the FEMA dollars with other dollars that may be available and bring them together? So it creates a much more complex project scope and in a much more layered capital stack. But it's, again, identifying what are all the dollars available, what is the project that needs to be accomplished, and then how do we bring, and we'll call Summer and say, Summer, we need to leverage your database to say, you know, how can we get all the little, you know, from the foundations, from the municipalities, from FEMA, and then, you know, sometimes, you know, there will be campaigns, you know, we call it capital campaigns if it's in the private sector, but it's the same idea. If there's enough of a need to bring together all those resources, and then of course the bank is going to come in and assess the viability of the project, and in areas where we can leverage FEMA dollars and simply bridge that. That's one of the easiest ways to provide capital. Others are a little bit more complex, but that's why you leverage your banking partners to come up with the appropriate solution.
Thanks, Dorothy. I raised that because it's a terrific example of collaborative opportunities, whether the driver is FEMA or the driver is the private sector, and the participants are what Summer does and what Regine does. The key is, and we will continue to say that, it's collaboration and partnership. And again, this panel is so terrific because we represent those different points of view and potential contributions. Summer, can you talk a little bit, because you've been out working with the smaller communities, with the tools, with the collaborative opportunities that you see. Can you address some of the innovative things you've seen smaller communities do to deal with resilience challenges that they face?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many examples, and you know, I was glad to see Angie's example in Princeville, and I'm sure we could all think of some. One that comes to mind that's kind of in the region that we're all talking about is in Kinston, North Carolina, which I think has a population around 20,000, somewhere thereabouts. And what they're doing right now is thinking through how they can take an existing park and convert it into one that has all sorts of stormwater features that can reduce flooding. And this project, I think, is in some ways really emblematic of what we're talking about, because they're focused on a location that is right near a bunch of low and middle income neighborhoods that primarily has a Black population. And right from the start, their focus was to center this project and coming up with what they wanted to do around community input, really engaging the neighborhood, which is not an easy feat during a pandemic, and especially because they started this, you know, somewhat earlier in the days of the pandemic. But they found some partners within the community working working with community-based organizations, working with American Flood Coalition, working with other groups that are innovative in Kinston and really have good methods for reaching the neighborhoods that would be most served by this park. And used all sorts of tactics, whether it's workshops, surveys, and so on and so forth, with the idea that they'll come away from that process with a plan that could lead to funding, that could lead to this project being undertaken and really serving those folks. That's one great example. I'm sure we could all share many more. There's lots of interesting things happening on the policy side. I won't keep it too long, but if folks want to look up Brevard, North Carolina, a small community, I think less than 10,000 population, that has some extremely advanced ordinances around development and flooding. And then there's some interesting things on the funding side too, and the city of Coral Gables creating a resilience fund that folks could look up if they're interested. So lots going on, and it all comes down to partnership, like you said, David.
Yep. Partnerships and collaboration. I mean, the challenges are big, but the opportunities are bigger. But it will take a collaborative approach to do it, to connect the dots. Regine, would really like to get your thoughts and advice as to how to engage, again, a common theme, how to engage the private sector in your work, and your suggestions on how to create sort of collaborative workings among various groups.
Yeah, to have the magic answer to that question, David. Maybe next year. There's a lot of really good work that's already being done, and that's my personal mantra for 2022, is to notice what's already really solid and in place that we can build off of. So there's such a, because hazard after hazard, right, there is such a tight collaboration of funders across the Gulf Coast. And so, working to connect the veritable dots between that collaborative group and the BRIC program, or looking at the Flood Coalition is one step for sure. It's also for us, the challenges is to shift the mindset away from that event driven, right? So that it's, I'm here for Ida, I'm here for Matthew, I'm here for Dorian, and instead say, I'm here for the region. I'm here, I'm here for to serve the underserved. And so that's, again, so there's that a little shift of mindset that we all need to work on. And I think that I'll leave that with my only two insights to the answer of your very big question, David.
Well, very, very insightful insights. I knew it wasn't an easy one to ask, or I wouldn't have asked it. Thank you. We've got, I guess we're right on time. We've got a few more minutes, and we're cutting into lunchtime, which is always dangerous. But if I may just ask each of you just 1 minute of final comment, observations, suggestions. Dorothy, would you go first, please?
I think I'll echo what you said. The need is great. The opportunity is greater. And I think that just on this panel alone, I think we've identified a lot of ways that we could, even amongst ourselves, collaborate to bring some really fantastic resources to some of these disadvantaged communities. And whether it's North Carolina, whether it's Florida, I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation and staying in touch with each of you.
Thank you. Regine, you put your hand up.
I did. I had a thought. So I learned from the first director of marketing and communications that CDP ever had, that there's no data without story, and there's no story without data. And what I love about what I love about all of us on this panel right now is that we all come with our data, but we also come with the story. And that to me is where we can really get some traction, right? And so that, Summer, I'm not gonna lie, I took a picture of one of your slides and already texted it over right in Word Alert. And I sent it over to my colleagues, and they're like, oh my gosh, we have to get that slide replicated for the Midwest. So again, our ability to balance that out with each other, I think is great.
Yeah, this is terrific. Thank you. Angie, your final thought?
So I just want to piggyback on, Regine's thought about, changing our mindset a bit. And the focus that I have really thought about in this space is that we have for so long and for so many good reasons focused on our own program delivery and how we deliver that and how we, deliver that well. But I think the thing that we've learned is that by doing that, we're creating complexity and we're not necessarily meeting the communities where they are and bringing a community-centric lens to our work. And there's such opportunity there if collectively, across both the public and private sector, we support communities in bringing, understanding their lens and what they need, and then us working together to be able to support them. And that's really our focus over the next several years.
Great point. Summer, you get one more.
Yeah, I'm in the unenviable task of going after everyone has said so many good things. I would echo all of that. And to your point, Regine, I've been taking lots of notes on everyone's slides, and there are a few things you said too that really struck a chord with me. So I appreciate that. I know to the point Angie was just making about really meeting communities where they are and understanding their needs. We talk at AFC a lot about being grounded, which is so important when you're a coalition that's encompassing a lot of different types of floodings, different regions, different sizes of communities. So I hope that this group can kind of continue that commitment of staying grounded in the need of the communities that maybe have the greatest needs and the least amount of resources, and also just continue collaborating, since it's clear that we all bring quite different things and complementary things to the table.
Thank you. Well, I'll wrap up quickly because I think lunch is calling a lot of folks. First of all, thank you to each of you for your time, your wisdom, your insight, and just your collegiality on the way that this has been approached. It's been an honor and a pleasure for me to do this. And I look forward to working with each of you to continue to keep the band going and to continue all this, because there's a lot here to continue. Sort of common themes. We've all done disaster work, resilience work over the years, and what we've all learned is it's really important to listen. It's really important to get on the ground and get your feet and your fingernails dirty and hear what's going on and what people need, and then fashion solutions together with others who are like-minded to leverage resources, to be helpful, and to come up with new and creative solutions. So listening is important. Information is important. People need, and particularly in small communities, but throughout the country, understanding, and I would call it information and not education, but information and awareness of what's out there, how it works, how things work together is critical. Communication, open communication, trusted communication, which flows from listening and truly trying to help people solve their problems, is critical. I've done a lot of disaster stuff in other countries, and the important part of getting things done is to create trust and understanding, which comes from transparency and listening. So that's important. And then finally, and how many times have we said this, the critical importance of collaboration and partnerships. So with that, thank you again. I look forward to working with all of you on partnerships and collaboration going forward.